Well, hello all, Game Methuselah. Well, I had an interesting experience this week, and I thought it maybe would share it with you because my writing partner Steve sent me a video from Questing Beast. And the video was really interesting. It was the fact that there was a huge DM shortage for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition in New York. I mean, there was really very few DMs out there who were running games, and people were complaining that it was just hard to get into a game or find a game or whatever because there just aren't any DMs. And he was, basically presenting the idea that now the game is so very complicated and daunting to people that, they basically, a lot of people don't want to DM. Now, there were all kinds of other reasons, more people coming to the game, the popularity, the fame, the online stuff. There's so many reasons why there are so many more people playing D&D, and so few of them are game masters. And he mentioned one of the people, obviously, who are game masters are grognards. And of course, being an old grognard, I thought I would kind of come up and talk about this again. Now, for those of you who've watched me, I've done many videos, and I always mention the same thing when you start talking about modules and stuff. I mean, the complexity level of current games and the idea of what they're doing isn't really new. Game designers have always been trying to improve their game and make things better and the like. And normally, I find that when people do that, they don't look at the concept of time versus good. They look at adding more things to it because, well, the more things you have, the more options you have, the more likely it has to be a good game. The other thought that I ran through my mind is people forget. When this game came out, 1974, most people started playing maybe 75, 76. That's when the real sort of big boom went on. There were no computer games. I mean, Pong, maybe. I don't know what else. And if anybody owned a computer in 75, I didn't know them. I think Richard got one maybe in 76. It was sort of a strange, bizarre thing. And it wasn't until the later 70s and obviously the 80s that, computer games became something. But for role-playing computer games, my argument has always been the same thing. Computer games are a box. They restrict what you can do. You can only do what the computer game is going to allow you to do. And they are very limiting into what your options are. The great thing with role-playing in the situation that existed in the 70s and still exists today, even though unfortunately most people don't delve into it, is it was freedom. It was the ability to expand your mind and do whatever you wanted to. And those who I've talked to about, scenarios and doing your things, you guys know I've never run a module. Not completely true, of course. I've run modules at game conventions and stuff to fill in, but I find them pitifully awful. And the reason is you have to say no. You got to tell your players you can't do that. You are limited or, anything else. There's limitations in all rule segments if you let them be rigid. And the rigidity is what kills the role-playing game because the best aspect is role-playing. The thing that is always important is find a way to say yes. To talk about 5th edition, you have, I'm sure anyone who's played it knows the idea. You have advantage and disadvantage in standard roll. So you either have to roll 2d20, pick the worst one for disadvantage, or your standard attack is a regular d20, or if you have advantage for whatever reason, you roll 2d20 and pick the best one. You can see the advantage. But that's still very restrictive. What if somebody wants to do something stupendously ridiculous? It's like, well, wait a second. What's wrong with rolling 3d20s and picking the worst one? Or 4d20s and picking the worst one? You can get my idea. The way to make things impossible is just to add another die. And that was the whole concept. And we were writing rules is the more things you do is the more to shift that ability so that the ridiculous is possible, just not probable. Now, a lot of games have all struggled with that between bell curves and all the different things, percentile die rolls. There's so many different ways to present rules. But as I've told most people, it doesn't matter about the rules. It matters about the game and the situation in the game. Now, don't put your players in a box. Let them do what they want. If you want to look at things, I tell people, look at the original game. It wasn't meant as a 300-page monolith of different concepts of rules and stuff. Original D&D was just a skeleton given you to build your ideas and put them on there. And they they gave you a skeleton framework. How to generate a dungeon, how to fill that dungeon with creatures, how to do all that stuff. And I'm sure you've seen this before, but I'll run it for you really quickly so you can just take a look at it. Excuse my eyes. The original thing, chainmail. Now, this is 3rd edition, 7th printing, 1979. Pretty much modern by all my standards. I mean, my original chainmail is worn out. What started the whole Dungeons and Dragon craze and what made it become what wonderful thing that it became was this. 11 pages in the back of a medieval miniature combat battle system that said fantasy. How you could have Lord of the Rings, elves and dwarves and hobbits and whatever, and orcs and goblins and dragons and monsters and stuff like that, all put in to your miniature battle. And, De Cruspieler Custom Cast was making Lord of the Rings figures, so there was miniatures out there, and there were other companies that were also doing it, even Jack Scrooby, and a lot of people who were out producing were still producing lots of Lord of the Rings stuff, because it was obviously very popular. They all got together and said, hey, everybody keeps sending us more information, wanting to see more and more about the Lord of the Rings. And they said, what about an idea? Because people started to talk about it, of having man-to-man battles with heroic characters like, Boromir or Aragorn or Legolas against maybe a horde of creatures and whatever. So this concept of a heroic party of people going to face the great masses of horrors and undeads and monsters and demons and dragons and wizards and all the horrible things you could do became something that just excited people, and thusly Dungeons and Dragons. TSR, Tactical Study Rules, 1974, original print. This isn't mine, belongs to my buddy Steve Kish. And the reason was really simple. Since I was the DM and I bought the rules, most people, like even current role-playing, didn't own the copy of the rules. So mine became the table copy. It didn't take long for these little pamphlets to essentially fall apart and become sort of worthless pieces of paper. But nothing really much has changed in the game. This is the player's handbook. Basically how you generate your basic player characters, get started, what spells and abilities you have, and all that. Really nothing very big in it. I mean, as far as it all goes, 36 pages. It's a pamphlet. It's a framework. And in and amongst those things, they always stated, because this is what they wanted, you have the freedom to design what you want. If you want to do more, it's just like I say in the design of my game. Ask the DM, I want to do more. You've already heard my stories and things about Matt Colville, and he wanted to run an Atlantean paladin. Sure, make up the rules, you can do it. Second book, essentially the monster manual. Now it's, again, very small pamphlet, 40 pages. It's all there, but it allows you to see what monsters are in the game and in the world and what they do. Could there be more? You bet there could be more. But at the time they printed it, that was what was there. The third and usually most unused book, this. This is essentially the Dungeon Master Guide. How to do it. The most important book in the game most people never looked at. Now, a lot of times the DMs would say, look, you could look at the first two. Realistically, you could look at the first one. You shouldn't look at the second one or even the third one because you shouldn't maybe have an insight in the monsters and stuff. So that was kind of how it was. So player handbooks usually got eaten up, pretty quickly. And this is the same, but it's a simple deal. Now, the problem is modules quickly came, and most of the modules that came out early was sort of just the standard dungeons and a little bit of world color and history and who was where and what was what and where the kingdoms lived and things. And still you had to build and create and do all the things yourself. And that still worked really great. Now, what came following were more things because more people immediately said, hey, we want more. We're loving it. It's starting to boom. They're starting to get great sales. So they come out with the first supplement, Greyhawk. And what this added was new player classes, something interesting more to have than essentially a fighter, cleric, or magic user. Lots more monsters, a much larger and expanded treasure list of things. So basically a little for everybody, but mostly stuff for the DM. And it worked out great. They gave you more options that you could randomly determine what was in them. The second was Blackmore. Now, Blackmore again added more characters, some more monsters, and an interesting thing where there were sort of weapon modifications, so types of weapons versus certain armor classes, kind of worked. And it's very, very confusing because people who were not into true gaming at the time didn't necessarily understand the charts. To be very frank, most of the players who did play lots of board games like myself still didn't understand it because it was such a new concept. Caltech produced their own, but if you own those original books, you're ready to play. The third one, great. It adds another concept of magic, adds some more monsters, mostly demons and things, and some kind of really badass magical items and a few other things. But it was less valuable. And then there was gods and demigods. For those you wanted to put legendary items in and have different god types for those you wanted to have more expansive gods than just something generic. It's all great. It all worked. And it was all up to the DM to determine what to do. Now, this is where modules, I think, have hurt people. And they really deep diving extensive rules and stuff have hurt people. People get dependent on running a module. A module is like a computer game. It's limited. You're stuck in what you can do within the module and within the rules. Anytime a player is going to push beyond that, get off the rails, as it were, it's up to you to decide if that's workable. Can they do it? And often people would say, well, no, you can't do that. You can't get off the rules. You're stuck with the module. And they get into the habit of depending on that like a crutch. You don't want to do that. I mean, the easiest thing to do was what they told you to do in the original pamphlets. And this is what I tell any new player to do. First thing you do is draw a dungeon. Now, the big advantage over that as a module is you're going to know all about your dungeon. It's going to be in your mind. As you're drawing it on your graph paper, you put down the contents of what's there. Now, if you don't have an idea, you can randomly determine it. You can get the little charts and it says, well, okay, at first level dungeon, you can have off to first, second, third, or fourth level monsters. Kind of nasty. Now, there's a fifth and a sixth chart, but you're not going to get down to those. But if you generate a second and a third level, and the levels were based upon you going down a set of staircases to a second level, then the monsters get nastier. You could get then off the, fifth chart. And then on the sixth level, you could basically not have any first level monsters, but it could be getting off the sixth chart. And the sixth level chart had things like Balrogs and dragons and giants and titans and all the things that basically, if you ran into, you were pretty much going to die. At any kind of low level. So if you're a first level character and you went down to the second level and you went down to the third level, you might as well generate new characters. I mean, pretty much anything you run into at that point is likely going to kill you at low level. Now, was it that hard to do? No. I always told people, draw first level. Just do it to that. Up to fourth level, you're going to have all the adventuring you want. And that's it. The second thing you do is create a little town, whether you draw it out or just have it in your mind, write down what buildings are there, what things are there. Hey, there's a blacksmith shop and a this and a that. And maybe even some guy who buys and sells gear and magical items and mystical stuff. And so you can do whatever you want to do. Now, if you can ever find a Spartan magazine that was put out by Balboa Games, Caltech, the guys over at Caltech, the Sheldon Coopers of the 70s, they really got into this game and they just decided, well, shoot, if little quantification is okay, we're going to just bomb it down. And they made all kinds of detail and they created their own magic system, everything else, everything that wasn't working perfectly in the game, they were going to fix and make perfect. And they had a lot of good stuff and it was very usable and you sort of can mix and mash. And I think by the mid-late 70s, most people before the first edition D&D came out were playing D&D 0, sort of had a hodgepodge of house rules and things they were doing, especially in Southern California. And all the games I played, there was lots of home rules. And that just depended upon where you came from. And truthfully, after a while, they sort of became accepted. But my group was large. But within that group, it was very vibrant. And were there a lot of DMs? Not really. I mean, they're talking about it now, but the point was everybody was coming into play. More than half of them wanted to DM. They wanted to have those creative juices come out there and put their own stories onto the game. And were all the stories great? No, not really, but they were all trying. And if anything else, they were sometimes pretty good. Now, there's the other half of the people who more likely never DM'd, and maybe didn't DM till much later. because they didn't feel comfortable talking to people, getting out here and unwinding a story to someone. And that's really what the game was all about. The game was all about what the players wanted to do. And they almost always drove it. So you had your little village, you had a sign up, somebody stole my pig, please go rescue him, or that you'd pick him off the wanted board, decide what you wanted, mission you want to go on, or you meet some shadowy individual at the local tavern. And everybody had a little town, and they had a little area, and they had a little map, and then you could go exploring. Now, the exploring was, I always said, the most dangerous thing in D&D, because of the way the rolls are written. On Overlands, you just rolled, and oh my gosh, if you had an encounter on Overland, it could be a dragon. And, if you're first level, you better run or hide or do whatever, because any dragon's going to come down and, eat your first little party. A smart thing that people originally figured out, and I think Steve Key was mentioning it in our game system, was basically what I did was, if you were 1 or 2 days away from your little starting village, you only could run into things on the first level dungeon chart. And if you were 3 or 4 days, you'd be on the second level dungeon chart. And I just did this, was just simple, so that you wouldn't run into the nastiest monsters on day 1 with your 0 level characters who are going to flee and, get eaten. And who wanted that to start the game? You want to at least get something going. And if players die, that's the way it goes. But then the dungeons were easy. You drew them out. You put in 20, 30 rooms. You then maybe picked a big bad guy. Who is the thing? Well, all right. In this first level, what's the you go to the third level chart. You say, what's the nastiest creature on here? It's a pack of gargoyles or something. And that could be what the big bad guy was on that level. The rest of the thing, there was a chart. You roll the chart for every room. On a 1 or a 2, there's nothing there. If there's something there, you roll a die. On a 1 to a 3, there's a monster with treasure. Basically, just roll that die. Was there something there? Yeah, you roll the die. If it's a 1, treasure only. If it's a 2 or a 3, you get monsters with treasure. And those would obviously tend to be a little better because they would usually be what you would call lair treasures. And the lair treasures were a little larger. And they gave you a brief synopsis of what the creatures were and how many showed up. And their numbers were terrible. I mean, not until they kind of quantified it later in their Greyhawk and Blackmoor, and they added more monsters, did you have a situation where they were sort of more realistic. They would just say, goblins number appearing, 30 to 300. Okay. Well, I think they meant in the whole dungeon. So if you were to run into a goblin lair, there's going to be 30 to 300 goblins in all these, and they're going to be in the rooms you roll on the first level, on the 1 to 2, or, 1 to 3, for the predominant amount. And that sort of worked, but a lot of people didn't understand that. So you got a lot of dungeons that were designed with, there'd be skeletons in one room and beetles in the next room, and then suddenly humans and goblins and orcs, and then there would be, an ochre jelly. It didn't make sense. But quickly people figured out, let's make a little coordinated item. It's a goblin lair. It's a dwarven mine. It's a this or it's a that or it's a something else. And that's maybe what the predominant things you're going to run into, which is very interesting because, even back then you ran into a dwarven mine, even though the dwarves are losing control of it, there's still going to be the majority of creatures there. So you're going to run into them and they're not happy to see you because they know you're down here to steal their stuff. And so you may run into dwarves and they're going to attack you. Unless you maybe have dwarves in your party, maybe you can negotiate, maybe you can role play and find out ways to let them get by, make a deal. Hey, look, we'll give you half the treasure we find, or we'll come in and we'll pick, and we get first choice of magic item, whatever the deal is. But all of it was spelled out. If you didn't have the chops to just figure it out, make it up yourself, there was a little chart. Another thing we used to do, which was really easy back then, is there was a little random dungeon thing in there where you could just say, well, okay, hall, door, behind the door, what's there? And it was terrible. I sort of made one down the road that was a lot greatly improved. But the idea was you could run a dungeon and say, okay, first dungeon, we'll all run together. Because none of us is the DM, and we'll run, and when it's done, we'll go back to the village, and we'll divvy up, and then you guys could all start making stuff as you want, and hopefully more people will get involved so one person isn't carrying the whole load of DMing. But that's it. What people do now is look at something that is very daunting. There's a huge book, monster manuals, multiples of them, adventure things, modules that have beautiful maps and page after page, and they lay out the rooms and they do a lot of really good stuff and they give it all to you. But the point now is it yours? Or do you have to read this whole tome? How long does it take you to read a module, learn it, absorb it, make it so you can actually run it without having to sit there and read it and then and read it to your players? It's going to be stilted. It's going to be difficult. Whereas if you draw your dungeon, well, you know what it looks like. Ooh, Mind Flayers made this dungeon using slave as an undead to create it. So it has this weird wall texture, and it's kind of convoluted, and there's all kinds of strange doors that seem to suit a different style creature. All these things can do it. You could lay out the lore. You can make it up out of your head as you're going. And it's going to be interesting because you see it, you feel it, you smell it. You don't need to read this large, involved module. But why do they make them? Well, they have to make them. First of all, people want them. Second of all, you gotta get enough money to keep your business going. There are so many great games that came and went because they just didn't have enough sales. And the easy thing is you get out there and you produce a rule, and the games are great. I talk about Dragon Quest, I talk about Fantasy Trip. A lot of these things, they lived on sometimes because they had just enough audience, or they were able to get enough audience to make it a little bit profitable. But some games like Dragon Quest, the companies just weren't satisfied with the amount that it produced. So there's no point in doing more for it. The game dies, no one ever knows about it, and no one ever realized there's a fabulous game system here you've never heard of or played. And you've heard all this from me. But I want to tell you, the thing about it is, if you are playing, don't get stuck in the great minutia. Get a group together of people, say, we all want to role play. Come up with your own idea, or steal a module and read the ideas like Matt did with Colorado the Vile, which is a module out of 4th edition. And he reskinned it, used it for 5th edition, and did all that. And then his character, he changes it. So you can use the stuff that's there. You can not use the stuff there. It's still up to you. But again, the concept is make it yours and make it so you can say yes to your players. A simple thing I said for 5th edition. If you're going to do stuff, don't limit the players. If they want to do ridiculous stuff, let them do it. Say, sure, you can try it. If it's going to be 3D20, pick the worst one because, it's really bad trying to jump a 70-foot chasm. You might make it, but likelihood you're going to have a plummet to your death or whatever the case may be. You're going to do a run and leap to stab the vampire with a stake. Maybe, but you got to give them a chance. When you just say, no, you can't do it, or, minus 20, or it's just not doable, or there's no rule for it in the game, I understand, always the mistake that gets made. That's why people don't want a DM, because the DM doesn't have to be the arbiter of the rules. Really, I say the best thing to do is get somebody else to arbitrate the rules. Matt had an idea with me when he used to go run his games over at Pandemic and Turtlerock and stuff. It would be like he'd bring me along to Mambo the monsters. He would just say, look, I'm going to run the adventure, do the whole thing. When the battles take place, you run the monsters. Because I was good at running monsters. I've experience at it. And he didn't have to then arbitrate and do everything else. He could run the game. I was controlling the creatures, the players were controlling their stuff. Things went smoother and faster. So I always tell people, if you're the low-end knowledge guy on the game group, who knows the rules? Look, you're the arbitrator of the rules. Now, they're not the arbitrator of the game, because all the D&D games tell you the DM has the right to change anything he wants. It's a complete mystery. So the game is fresh and interesting and different every time. It's your game, not a module. The other problem modules always had was they're available in stores, which means if you're going to run a module campaign, well, maybe one of your players goes down and buys the module, decides to read the module. We had players that did that. I never understood it. I said, why are you ruining the game for yourself by reading the module? Well, I really want to know. Wait, you mean you want to know what's going to happen before it happens? Really? It didn't make any sense to me. And it doesn't make any sense to me on the same way for this. Don't limit your game. Expand your game. Do more all the time. If players say, I want to try something, sure. Like I said, I gave you the easiest thing in 5th edition. Just add an extra die. Add an extra die. If it's easy, give them a 3rd advantage die, 4th advantage die. Those are the things that are important for you in DMing. Why there's a DM shortage? All of the Questing Beasts' ideas were really good. They're there. But the whole thing about it is, it's just too daunting. But most senior players and vintage players like me are the easiest people to DM for, because they're going to help you with the rules. They're going to make sure you don't fall on your face. They're going to, if you forget something, they're going to say, oh, by the way, this and that and this and that. Because, if they know the rules, say, oh, I really can't do that, or he can't do that, or whatever, or the monster can do this, or you forgot that they can do that. And because and you want the DM to expand. You want him to have a great great effect. You don't want to argue with the DM. You don't want to fight with the DM. The last thing you want to do is find a dungeon master and make his night miserable. Because at that point, you're kind of guaranteeing that either A, if you were, singling him out and being a jerk, you're never going to get invited back. Second thing about it is, if you are part of the group and he's maybe exterior, he's just never going to run again. And that's the mistake you make. You're running his game and he's presenting all these things and you're thinking, well, that's not the rules. Or, that's a different, that I never saw. Doesn't matter. He's presented you his game. This is what exists. And the game, realistically, if you follow that concept of the DM can do anything he wants, that's what you do want. You want that mystery. You want to open that door and go, what did I run into? How difficult is it? You don't want your games limited. So get everybody in it to DM. We had a large group. We played Fantasy Trip for a long time, and everybody had to DM. Now, Don and myself, we ran the bulk, but Kevin ran a bunch, and Richard ran a bunch, and even his wife Sue ran, and then his wife, and then Don's wife, Maria got in, and she started running. Before you know it, we had 7 or 8 really competent dungeon masters. So that, you might, in a situation which amazed me, I DM once, DM twice, get enough adventure, we'll take a break, and it came back, I might not adventure DM again for a month, maybe more. That really makes your group great to have everyone out there. And, that just takes that everyone is supportive in making sure that they're making the game excellent for everybody. Because, you're not going to always have the greatest DM, but that doesn't mean they're not going to become the greatest DM. Anyway, the point on all of this is don't look for crutches. Look for ways to expand your group and game. Do things, that are excellent in the game, and then go from there. And the game will expand, and you will expand, and your skills will expand, and everything will be better. And there will be more people playing. Now it's very tough. Most people look at it and they say, well, I got to buy the rules, then I got to buy the monster manual, and then I got to buy the DMG, and then I got to buy the module book, that's going to give me a whole set of adventures. And then, do you have miniatures? Do you have everything else? There's a cost factor in there. And I used to say that the vast majority of people who play D&D didn't even own a pencil. So there used to be an inexpensive game. Now it's a little less so. But it still can be. You can be a person who invites people in and gets them started. And they're going to have different aspects of the game they're going to like. So tailor your group. If you've got a group that likes lots of talking, lots of role-playing, wants to sort of talk your way out of most of the stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe I want to do a little bit more military and battle-centric, but that's just me. You want to play what's going to be best for your players. Now, I can go on, and more likely will continue to go on this, because I've done these. And if you go back through my others, you'll hear a lot of this repeated back, or different things that I've talked about. It's not hard, but people make it hard. Don't do that. Make it simple. Dungeon, village, then a leader, bad boss, castle, second dungeon, a world map, maybe not a world map, just a small area map. I did a map, I think I showed one of my videos. I said, we ran for well over a year, never got out of this valley. You don't need to have this horrendous, large expanse of the world, because you're never going to be able to fill it. And even the companies have difficulty filling it. I've seen so many large world areas where most of it's still, Living Greyhawk was about the only time I saw things that were really, really, really complete. And if you ever look into it, look into, 3rd edition, 3.5, Living Greyhawk. And if you can find the expansion rules, there's rule books on it, there was so much world detail there that it made it worth playing. But, when they went to 4th edition, they made it Forgotten Realms. And, there was maybe less in Forgotten Realms or more, but it never had the same thing. But play Living Greyhawk or play in Greyhawk, and, you could really see an immersive game, because this was the world that Gary Gygax created, and everybody built on that. And you've got 50 years of people building and building and building upon a world. You get a pretty detailed world, and it's worth seeing, and it's worth playing, and it's worth thinking about as a game. There's so many other settings you can use. And of course, there's always yours, which you should consider. So anyway, I've droned on way too much about this, but I just wanted to say, if there's a shortage of game masters in your group, step up. Step up and say, hey, look, I'll just start it out easy. We'll do a dungeon crawl. We got a little village that'll buy the extra gear that we find that we don't want, the swords and the shields from the dead goblins or whatever, and you get a little silver and gold that way. We'll find some treasure. We'll move ahead. Buy the PDF of the original game. I think it used to be $5, but you can buy the PDF of that, Greyhawk and Blackmore. You can read that, and it will give you the whole concept of how to build something out of nothing. Because when you got it in 1974, believe me, nobody had anything at all. So, I don't know if this is helpful. I know it was interesting listening to Questing Beast talking about this. It was interesting to hear that, of course, there's a big, shortage of experienced game masters out there. So maybe I should sell my services as a wandering, traveling dungeon master, which sounds miserable to me. But nonetheless, you can do it, and it's really easy. But keep it simple. Keep it simple as you start. Keep it small and controllable. Make it yours, not a module you have to spend a week reading so you can run it. And you'll be able to just pop out adventures. And if you do 1 and you do 2 and you do 3, 4, 5, by the time you get to that 6th or 7th or 8th adventure, you're the pro from Dover. You've got it wired. And boy, if your first dungeon is you roll it and it's like a goblin dungeon and you've got a few monsters here and there, suddenly now you have a thematic. And then from that, well, why are the goblins here and what's controlling them, what's running them? Is there something, who knows what it is? That's where your game can grow and expand as you want it to. And, that's what makes the game fun and exciting. Don't limit yourself. Don't limit your players by putting yourselves in a box that, like a computer game, doesn't let you step out of the parameters. Make it so it's open-ended. And as I told you in my last video, at this point, I don't know where my campaigns are going. Once the players go off the rails, the sky's the limit. We'll find out what the consequences for that are as the game proceeds. But that's the excitement point. You've got to make it up on the fly, or after an adventure, think about, what happened? And what am I going to do from this point on? And how did their actions affect the world? How did the actions affect the town, affect people? What happens? There's suddenly a little thieves guild that wants to get back at them. There's a million things that can happen, and it's all up to you to open your mind and make it an option and availability for your players to make their games exciting for them. So give it a try. I know this has been heard. I know you guys have seen this, and I know everyone still falls back into the modules. But the modules are a crutch that makes you weaker. End up walking, jogging, running on your own, building your own content. You can grab modules, you can read them, you can steal the concept out of them, but don't run it page by page by page. Just run it and add your own stuff. Of course, I think you should give them more magical items because, that's sort of the currency of the game. Cool magical items are everything. You give people a bazillion gold pieces, they're not going to care. But you give them a really cool magical item, man, that makes the day. Until I have a chance to speak with you again, fight me, devils, fight, for I hate peace. Game on, and write your own stuff. Let me know how it goes.